I used to believe that help would arrive. Not in a dramatic way. Not with sirens or miracles. Just, eventually, someone would notice. Someone would ask the right question. Someone would see past the smiles and realize I was barely holding myself together. I believed that if I waited long enough, something or someone would step in and change everything. That belief kept me alive longer than I cared to admit, and it almost destroyed me. Thank you for coming across my video. Please watch till end. Comment, like, and share. Please also subscribe to my channel. Thanks. Growing up, I learned early how to stay quiet. Not because I was shy, but because staying quiet made things easier. When you don't speak, you don't create problems. When you don't ask, you don't get rejected. When you don't need anything, nobody can disappoint you. At least, that's what I told myself. I became good at reading rooms, good at sensing moods, good at shrinking myself before anyone asked me to. If something hurt, I swallowed it. If something felt unfair, I made excuses for it. If someone crossed a line, I convinced myself it was my fault for standing too close. I told myself that this is just how life works, that everyone feels this tired, that everyone feels invisible sometimes. So I waited. I waited in friendships where I was always the listener but never the one being heard. I waited in relationships where my needs felt like inconveniences. I waited in family situations where love existed, but understanding didn't. I waited at jobs that drained me, telling myself I just needed to earn my rest. I waited in silence, thinking patience would eventually be rewarded, because surely someone would notice. I was the reliable one, the strong one, the calm one, the one who always said, "I'm okay." People came to me with their problems, their breakdowns, their midnight crises. I stayed up listening while my own thoughts screamed for attention. I showed up. I helped. I fixed what I could fix. And every time I helped someone else stand back on their feet, a small part of me thought, maybe now they'll see me. But they never did. Because I never fell apart in front of them. That was my mistake. I thought strength would attract care. I thought being easy to love would make people love me deeper. I thought if I proved I didn't need help, people would offer it anyway. But the world doesn't work like that. The world assumes you're fine if you look fine. And I looked fine. I perfected the smile, the laugh, the reassurance. Don't worry about me. I'll figure it out. It's not that serious. I said those words so often that they became my identity. Until one day, they became a lie I could no longer survive. The breaking point didn't come during a dramatic moment. There was no explosion, no shouting, no final argument. It came quietly. On an ordinary day, one of those days where nothing goes wrong but nothing goes right either. I remember sitting alone, staring at my phone, realizing I had spent years being available to everyone, and there was no one I felt safe calling. Not one person I could say, "I'm not okay," without feeling like a burden. My chest felt heavy, not with sadness, with clarity. I replayed moments in my head, all the times I hinted instead of asked, all the times I downplayed my pain so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. All the time someone checked in once, and I replied, "I'm good," hoping they'd push past it. No one ever did. And suddenly, it hit me. Not as a thought, but as a truth I couldn't escape. Nobody was coming, not because they didn't care, but because I trained them not to. I taught people how to treat me. I taught them that I didn't need support, that my pain wasn't urgent, that my limits didn't exist. And I taught myself that waiting was safer than demanding. That realization hurt more than any betrayal, because I couldn't blame anyone else. I had spent my life waiting for permission to need something, waiting for someone to notice the cracks without me pointing them out, waiting for rescue while refusing to raise my hand. And in that waiting, I stayed stuck. Stuck in situations that drained me, stuck in roles that exhausted me, stuck being the version of myself everyone was comfortable with. Except me. There's a unique kind of pain that comes from realizing you've been abandoning yourself. Not out of hatred, but out of hope. Hope that someone else would show up so you wouldn't have to. I felt grief not just for what I went through, but for how long I let it happen. That night, I didn't cry loudly. I didn't break anything. I just sat there. And for the first time, I stopped waiting. I didn't make a plan. I didn't have answers, but I made a decision. If nobody was coming to save me, then I had to stop living like someone else would. Saving yourself isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like motivation videos or overnight transformation. Sometimes it looks like saying no for the first time and shaking while you do it. Sometimes it looks like disappointing people who benefited from your silence. Sometimes it looks like loneliness because boundaries feel like abandonment to those who never respected them. I lost some people when I stopped overgiving. Some drifted quietly. Some reacted loudly. But all of them revealed something important. They were never there for me. They were there for what I provided. I started listening to the parts of myself I used to ignore. The exhaustion, the resentment, the quiet anger, the sadness I kept pushing down. And instead of telling myself to be grateful, I let myself be honest. That honesty was uncomfortable, but it was real. Healing didn't happen all at once. I still struggle. I still catch myself waiting, still hoping someone will notice when things get hard. But now, I notice. I check in with myself. I slow down. I ask for help, even when my voice shakes. Because the day I realized nobody was coming to save me was also the day I realized I was worth saving. And maybe you're listening to this because you're tired too. Tired of being strong. Tired of being understanding. Tired of waiting for someone to care enough to ask twice. If so, let me tell you something I wish someone told me sooner. You're not invisible. You're not dramatic for wanting support. And you're not weak for needing help. But waiting in silence won't bring rescue. Choosing yourself will. If this story felt like it was written for you, then you're not alone anymore. You're just at the beginning. Part 2. Continuing the story. After that realization, life didn't suddenly become easier. In fact, for a while, it became harder. Because when you stop waiting to be saved, you start seeing everything clearly. And clarity can be cruel. I saw how exhausted I really was. How much of my life had been built around survival instead of desire. How often I stayed where I was shrinking just because it felt familiar. There was no rush of courage, no surge of confidence, just a quiet fear. Because if nobody was coming to save me, then there were no excuses left either. I noticed how often I minimized myself. At work, I took on more than I could handle because saying no felt selfish. In conversations, I softened my opinions so no one would feel threatened. In relationships, I accepted half effort and called it love. It wasn't that I didn't know I deserved better. It was that I didn't trust better to stay. So I chose tolerable. There's something terrifying about realizing you've been living on autopilot. Not because you wanted to, but because stopping felt dangerous. When you've built an identity around being needed, being invisible feels like losing your purpose. I feared that if I stopped giving, I would stop mattering. And in some cases, that fear came true. Some people didn't ask how I was doing anymore. Some only reached out when they needed something. Some faded quietly, like they were never really there to begin with. That hurt. But what hurt more was realizing how conditional their presence had always been. I wasn't losing real connections. I was losing habits. I began sitting with discomfort instead of running from it. Silence started feeling louder. Loneliness more honest. I learned that peace doesn't always feel good at first. Sometimes it feels empty because chaos was all you knew. And in that emptiness, I met parts of myself I had ignored for years. The tired part, the angry part, the grieving part. They weren't dramatic. They were just done. There were days I wanted to go back. Back to over-explaining. Back to over-giving. Back to being low maintenance so I wouldn't be alone. But I remembered the cost. The sleepless nights. The constant knot in my chest. The way my body reacted before my mind admitted something was wrong. I remembered how waiting almost broke me. And that memory kept me moving forward slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly. I learned something strange about strength. Real strength isn't about carrying everything without complaint. It's about choosing what's actually yours to carry. I stopped answering messages immediately. Stopped apologizing for resting. Stopped explaining emotions to people committed to misunderstanding me. That didn't make me cold. It made me intact. For the first time, my life felt quieter. Not lonelier, quieter. No constant urgency. No feeling like I was behind. No desperate hope that someone would finally step in. Just me. and that scared me more than anything else ever had. But in that fear, something unexpected happened. I began trusting myself. Not because I had it all figured out, but because I was finally listening. When something felt wrong, I stopped gaslighting myself out of it. When something hurt, I didn't rush to justify it away. When I needed rest, I allowed it without earning it. I became the one who noticed. There's a grief that comes with growth. Grief for the version of you who didn't know better, who waited, who hoped love meant endurance. I don't judge that version of myself. They were doing the best they could with the tools they had, but I don't live there anymore. Sometimes people ask what changed, what made me different. I never know how to answer, because nothing dramatic happened. No single event, no big betrayal, no turning point anyone else would notice. Just a quiet moment where I realized, if I don't choose myself, no one else will do it for me. And I didn't want to live another day hoping someone would prove my worth. I still believe in connection, still believe in love, but not the kind that requires self-erasure, not the kind that rewards silence, not the kind that only shows up when you're useful. I believe in relationships where honesty doesn't feel dangerous, where needing help isn't a failure, and where I'm not okay is met with presence, not discomfort. And if you haven't found that yet, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Sometimes it means you haven't stopped abandoning yourself long enough to make space for it. The day I realized nobody was coming to save me was the day I stopped waiting to live. Life didn't magically transform after that realization. There was no sudden wave of confidence, no triumphant music playing in the background. What happened instead was quieter, awkward, uncertain, unsteady. It was rebuilding, the kind that happens slowly, quietly, privately, the kind nobody applauds because nobody sees it. I started with small decisions, not the big life changes people talk about online, not the dramatic, quit my job, cut everyone off, moved across the country transformations. Just small, almost invisible choices. I started responding to messages when I actually had energy. I started letting calls go to voicemail when I needed silence. I started taking deep breaths before saying yes, and sometimes I said no. The world didn't collapse when I said it. Nobody screamed. Nobody hated me. Nobody exploded. Most people didn't even notice. But I noticed, because no was the first boundary I'd ever built for myself. It stood there, quietly, like a door I had the right to keep closed. I began questioning my own patterns. Why did I rush to fix everything? Why did I offer help before anyone even asked? Why did rejection feel humiliating even when I wasn't rejected? Why did being alone scare me when being surrounded drained me? The answers didn't come immediately. Some were painful. Some were uncomfortable. Some forced me to confront truths I had buried beneath "I'm fine." But with each answer, I understood myself a little more. And with understanding came something I had never felt before: compassion for myself. Letting go hurt more than holding on. I wish I could say I gracefully outgrew everything that wasn't meant for me. But growth doesn't work like that. Some connections cracked slowly. Some snapped all at once. Some drifted away without either of us realizing it until months later. People who liked the version of me who never asked for anything didn't know what to do with the version who finally did. They didn't understand why I was quieter now, why I stopped volunteering myself for every crisis, why I wasn't available at any hour, for any reason. To them, my healing looked like distance. To me, their discomfort looked like proof that I had been giving far more than I ever received. Loneliness came first, then peace. Healing can feel like isolation at first. You step back to breathe, and suddenly you realize how many connections were built on your inability to. There were evenings when the silence felt sharp, nights when I wondered if choosing myself meant choosing to be alone forever. Moments where I almost went back, not because I missed the pain, but because I missed the company. But loneliness didn't stay. It transformed. Slowly, gradually, without me noticing. Loneliness softened into solitude. Solitude softened into peace. Peace softened into self-respect. And self-respect, the quiet, powerful kind, changed everything. I started showing up for myself, not in big ways, in the little ways that mattered. I took walks without explaining where I was going. I ate meals without rushing. I rested without guilt gnawing at me. I allowed myself to feel sad without apologizing for it. I didn't earn these things. I simply deserved them. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to say that I could rest, or breathe, or break, or heal. I was giving myself permission that I used to wait for from everyone else. And then something unexpected happened. I stopped craving rescue, not because I didn't need help sometimes, but because I finally trusted myself to ask for it honestly. I didn't hint. I didn't hope someone would sense my exhaustion telepathically. I didn't swallow my needs until they festered into resentment. I simply said, I need support right now, and the right people, the people who were meant to stay, showed up, quietly, steadily, without conditions, not because they wanted to use me, not because they needed something from me, but because connection is supposed to go both ways. I never knew what that felt like until I stopped being the only one holding everything together. Strength stopped feeling like suffering. For years, I believed strength meant endure, carry, contain, but strength is not the absence of weakness. Strength is the willingness to face the truth. The truth that I needed help sometimes. The truth that I had limits. The truth that I didn't have to be everything for everyone. I stopped romanticizing self-destruction in the name of loyalty. Stopped believing suffering made me worthy. Stopped pretending independence meant isolation. I realized something simple. Strength is choosing yourself, even when it disappoints others. And that choice changed everything. Not instantly, not dramatically, not in a way others would celebrate, but in a quiet, steady way that shifted the course of my life. I no longer rushed to solve problems that weren't mine. I no longer molded myself to fit into spaces that didn't welcome me. I no longer stayed in rooms where my presence was tolerated instead of valued. I chose myself not out of selfishness, but out of survival. And for the first time, survival didn't feel like drowning. It felt like breathing. Because the day I realized nobody was coming to save me, I finally stopped abandoning myself. And that was the beginning of everything. Becoming someone I could rely on. There's a moment in every healing journey when you look back and realize how different you've become. Not because life suddenly became perfect. Not because the world finally treated you gently. Not because everyone around you changed. But because you changed. You respond differently. You choose differently. You forgive differently. You walk away differently. Your silence is no longer fear. Your boundaries are no longer guilt. Your solitude is no longer punishment. You become someone you can rely on. And that changes everything. The first time I chose myself over approval, I remember the exact moment I prioritized my own well-being over someone else's expectations. It wasn't dramatic. Someone asked me for a favor. A small one. Something I normally would have said yes to without hesitation. But I was exhausted, emotionally drained. Running on the last pieces of myself, I typed, sure. Then, I deleted it. I stared at the screen for a long time, and chose the version of me who deserved rest. I typed, I can't right now. Just 4 words. But they felt like rebellion, like liberation, like stepping into a life I never believed I was allowed to live. The person responded, oh, okay. No anger, no guilt trip, no disappointment. The world didn't fall apart. Only my fear did. I started protecting my energy like it meant something. Because it did. My peace mattered. My time mattered. My feelings mattered. My presence mattered. I used to think the only way to be valued was to give endlessly. To show worth by being indispensable. To earn connection through sacrifice. But people who only value you when you're useful aren't valuing you. They're valuing access. And access is a privilege, not an obligation. So, I stopped giving it to everyone. I learned to sit with my emotions, instead of running from them. For the first time, I didn't distract myself from loneliness. I didn't numb sadness with productivity. I didn't look for validation in places that emptied me. I didn't bury my feelings under a fake smile. I let myself feel them. Raw, unedited, ungraceful. I cried without apology. I rested without guilt. I grieved without pretending I was overreacting. And as painful as that honesty was, it healed me more than denial ever did. Self-trust. wasn't built in a moment, it was built in repetition. Every time I kept a promise to myself, I grew stronger, not in the nothing can hurt me way, but in the I will never abandon myself again way. I showed up for myself on bad days, not just good ones. I rested when my body whispered, not when it screamed. I listened to my intuition before asking others what they thought. Slowly, quietly, steadily, I became someone I could depend on. Someone I didn't have to chase for care. Someone who wouldn't ghost me when things got hard. Someone who didn't treat my needs like inconveniences. I became my own safe place. The world responded differently once I did. People sensed it. I carried myself with a new steadiness. Not arrogance. Not coldness. Just certainty. A kind of quiet confidence that came from no longer begging for love, attention, or permission. People who once took advantage found it harder to access me. People who only valued my silence struggled to understand why I wasn't quiet anymore. People who were meant to stay found deeper ways to connect. Energy doesn't lie. And mine was finally aligned with someone who deserved good things. Not everyone celebrated my growth, and that was a lesson too. Some people pulled away. They weren't interested in the version of me who spoke up. The version with boundaries. The version who said no without explaining it 3 times. The version who didn't bend just to keep the peace. And for a while, I wondered if that meant I was becoming difficult. But then I realized, people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always see your healing as hostility. They weren't losing me. They were losing control. And that was never mine to carry. I no longer needed to be saved. I needed to be understood. There's a difference. Being saved means handing your power to someone else. Being understood means sharing your truth without fear. I didn't want rescuers anymore. Didn't want people who only appeared when my life was on fire. Didn't want temporary support disguised as loyalty. I wanted connection. The kind where silence doesn't equal distance. Where vulnerability isn't weaponized. Where being myself doesn't feel like a risk. And slowly, when I stopped settling, those connections found me. Not instantly, not perfectly, but authentically. Because when you stop abandoning yourself, you no longer tolerate being abandoned by others. Everything began with one realization. Nobody was coming to save me. But in that truth, I found something better. I found myself. And the version I found wasn't weak, or broken, or unworthy. They were just buried under years of pretending. And now that they had space to breathe, I finally understood what it meant to live. Healing rarely announces itself. It doesn't come with fireworks or applause. There's no clear line between before and after. Most days feel the same until one day they don't. For me, the transformation didn't show up as confidence or joy at first. It showed up as calm. A calm that felt foreign, suspicious, even. Like I was waiting for something to go wrong, because that was what life had taught me to expect. But it didn't go wrong. The calm stayed. And slowly, I allowed myself to trust it. I realized I didn't react the same anymore. Someone made a careless comment, the kind that used to linger in my mind for days. But this time, it didn't sink into me. It didn't become a story I told myself. It didn't reopen old wounds. Instead, a simple thought crossed my mind. This isn't mine to carry, and I let it go. It felt strange, liberating, almost unbelievable. I wasn't numb. I wasn't hardened. I was simply no longer available for pain that wasn't meant for me. I became someone who didn't beg for the bare minimum. I stopped chasing people who made me feel optional. Stopped explaining myself to those committed to misunderstanding me. Stopped lowering the volume of my needs so others could stay comfortable. And suddenly, things that once felt acceptable didn't anymore. Half-hearted effort, inconsistent affection. People who showed up only when life was convenient. I used to interpret those things as normal. Part of life. Something I had to tolerate if I wanted connection. But healing changes your definition of normal. I realized I wasn't asking for too much. I was just asking the wrong people. I learned the difference between loneliness and being alone. Loneliness used to terrify me. It used to feel like proof that something was wrong with me. Like I was forgettable, replaceable, unwanted. But as I grew into myself, being alone stopped feeling like abandonment. It began to feel like choice, like rest, like clarity. like finally hearing my own voice without the noise of other people's expectations. I wasn't isolated. I was reconnecting with myself. And that connection turned out to be the most important one I'd ever build. My past stopped embarrassing me. For years, I carried shame for the old version of me, the one who tolerated too much, stayed too long, loved too hard, waited too quietly, gave too deeply. I used to see that version as weak. Now, I see them as someone who survived with what they knew, someone who kept going even when nobody held them, someone who wanted love so badly they were willing to shrink for it. There's nothing weak about someone who keeps trying despite pain. I forgave them, and in that forgiveness, I freed myself. Some people didn't recognize the new me, and that was okay. Growth is unsettling to those who benefited from your stagnation. People who once expected unlimited access began to feel the weight of your boundaries. People who relied on your silence heard your voice clearly for the first time. People who assumed you'd always be available had to face the truth. You were no longer living for them. Some complained. Some drifted. Some tried to guilt me back into old patterns. But I didn't step backward. Not this time. You can love people and still outgrow the version of yourself they were attached to. I stopped measuring my worth by what I could do for others. For the first time, I asked myself, who am I when I'm not trying to be needed? The answer didn't arrive immediately, but I started noticing little things. I liked quiet mornings. I liked slow conversations filled with real understanding. I liked being around people who didn't drain me just by being themselves. I liked doing things simply because they made me feel alive, not useful. I discovered passions I never had time for. Dreams I never believed I deserved. Parts of myself I had buried just to survive. I wasn't rebuilding the old me. I was meeting the real me. And then something even more unexpected happened. I stopped fearing the future. For so long, life felt like something that happened to me. A series of events I had to endure. A weight I had to carry without complaint. But now, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like possibility. Not because everything was perfect, but because I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. I had survived every moment that tried to break me. Not gracefully, not effortlessly, but successfully. And if I could survive all that while abandoning myself, imagine what I could build now that I wasn't. The day nobody came to save me, I started saving myself. Not with grand gestures, not with dramatic changes, but with quiet, consistent choices. Choosing rest, choosing boundaries, choosing truth, choosing peace, choosing myself. And slowly, life responded. Because when you treat yourself like you matter, the world adjusts. The people who are meant to stay deeper. The people who aren't, fade on their own. And you stop mistaking their absence for loss. You recognize it as space. Space for better. Space for growth. Space for the life you were meant to live all along. Learning to live without fear. There's a strange thing that happens when you stop waiting to be saved. Fear begins to lose its power. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But slowly, like a tight grip loosening finger by finger. Fear had shaped so much of my life. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of being alone. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being too much. Fear of not being enough. But the biggest fear was this. The fear of needing help and not receiving it. That fear kept me silent, kept me small, kept me strong in all the wrong ways. But when I accepted that nobody was coming to save me, that fear stopped controlling me. Because once you realize you can survive without rescue, you stop living like you're one misstep away from collapse. I stopped avoiding hard truths. For most of my life, I tried to soften discomfort. I made excuses for people who hurt me. I downplayed my own needs. I convinced myself that it wasn't that bad when it actually was. I pretended things didn't matter when they mattered deeply. But healing means facing truths you used to avoid at all costs. Like, some people will never give you the apology you deserved. Some relationships only survive when you carry the weight. Some environments were built to drain you, not grow you. Some dreams were handed to you, not chosen by you. And the hardest truth of all, the person I needed the most was me. Not the idealized savior I imagined waking up one day. Not the friend who was supposed to finally understand me. Not the partner I hoped would read my silence like a diary. Just me. The me who had been waiting quietly for permission to take up space. I started speaking up, even when my voice shook. The first time I expressed my needs out loud, I felt guilty, selfish, exposed. Every word felt heavier than the last. Not because they were unreasonable, but because I wasn't used to being heard. I had spent years molding myself into someone who didn't cause conflict, someone easy to handle, someone who preferred peace over honesty. But silence is not peace. Silence is self-erasure. So I spoke, not perfectly, not confidently, but sincerely, and with each truth I voiced, I reclaimed a part of myself I didn't realize I had lost. Some people pulled away, and it didn't break me this time. Before, losing people felt like losing air. Every goodbye felt personal. Every distance felt like proof that something was wrong with me. But now, I didn't interpret absence as failure. I interpreted it as clarity. Not everyone is meant to stay with you through every chapter. Some only fit the version of you that never asked for anything. Some were comfortable with your silence but unprepared for your truth. Some needed the old you to feel like the best version of themselves. And that's okay. Releasing them wasn't punishment. It was alignment. People who love the real you never leave because you became honest. They stay because the honesty finally makes the connection genuine. I began building a life that reflects who I am, not who I was. For the first time, I asked myself real questions. What makes me feel alive? What kind of relationships feel nourishing? What goals are truly mine? What dreams did I abandon because I didn't believe I deserved them? What kind of life do I want to wake up to every day? The answers weren't always clear, but they were honest. And that honesty shaped a new direction. I stopped pretending I was satisfied with crumbs, stopped pretending chaos was normal, stopped pretending martyrdom was strength. I wanted softness. I wanted meaning. I wanted connection that didn't require betrayal of myself. And wanting those things wasn't too much. It was just new. I started celebrating small wins, not the kind the world applauds. The quiet victories. The day I said no without explaining. The morning I woke up without heaviness. The moment I recognized red flags without doubting myself. The night I fell asleep knowing I didn't betray my own boundaries. The conversation where I expressed my feelings and didn't apologize for having them. These wins weren't small to me. They were monumental. Because they proved I was changing from the inside out. Healing didn't make me perfect. It made me present. I still have days when I feel overwhelmed. Days when old patterns whisper to me. Days when I crave the comfort of familiar pain. Days when I wonder if I'm strong enough to keep going. But now, I don't run from those days. I face them. I sit with the discomfort instead of abandoning myself in it. I give myself the compassion I used to reserve only for others. I take a breath and remind myself, I've survived worse than this. Because I have, and I will again. Not because someone will save me, but because I trust myself to save me. And that trust changed my entire life. Not by making things easy, but by making them possible. When you trust yourself, you stop begging for reassurance. You stop fearing loss. You stop settling for what hurts. You stop shrinking to fit into places you've outgrown. You start living, not reacting, not pleasing, not surviving, living. For yourself, the mirror I had avoided. There came a day when I looked at myself, truly looked, for the first time in years. Not at my reflection, not at my appearance, not at the surface-level version of me that moved through the world. I looked inward, and what I saw stopped me. Because for so long, I had lived as a shadow of myself, a quieter, smaller, dimmer version created for survival. But now, the shadow was fading. I saw someone tired, yes. Someone scarred, yes. Someone who had carried too much for too long. Absolutely. But beneath all that, I saw strength, not the performative kind, not the kind forged through pretending everything was fine, not the kind shaped by silence or endurance. I saw the strength of someone who faced themselves and didn't look away, someone who chose honesty over comfort, someone who broke patterns that once felt like home, someone who rebuilt without applause. I had never admired myself before, but in that moment, I did. The grief of becoming someone new. Nobody warns you about this part. The grief, the mourning. Because when you grow, a part of you dies. The part that tolerated the intolerable. The part that begged for crumbs. The part that kept choosing people who wouldn't even choose themselves. The part that learned to stay quiet to keep the peace. The part that kept waiting for someone else to fix what was breaking inside. I felt sorrow for that version of me. Not because they were weak, but because they deserved better, and didn't know how to ask for it. Healing means grieving the person you were, so you can make space for who you're becoming. And that grief? It's heavy, but it's sacred. When things finally started to make sense, it didn't happen in a single moment. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. It wasn't a dramatic turning point. It wasn't a moment where the world suddenly became brighter. It happened slowly. Like a sunrise spreading light across a landscape I had only ever seen in darkness. Little things made sense first. Why certain relationships always left me empty. Why I was drawn to people who didn't know how to love themselves. Why I tolerated treatment that bruised my spirit. Why I overgave, overworked, overstayed. I wasn't broken. I was conditioned. Conditioned to believe my worth was earned, not inherent. Conditioned to prove I deserved love by sacrificing myself. Conditioned to fear losing people more than losing myself. Understanding this didn't erase the past, but it explained it. And that clarity felt like breathing fresh air after years underground. The first time I felt proud of myself. Not for something big, not for an achievement the world applauds, but for something quiet. One evening, I caught myself smiling. Not because of someone else, not because of validation, not because something extraordinary happened. I smiled because I liked who I was becoming. I liked the way I no longer apologized for existing. I liked the way I protected my peace. I liked the way I didn't chase people who drifted. I liked the way I spoke more gently to myself. I liked the way I allowed rest without guilt. I realized I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. And that realization felt like warmth spreading through a place inside me that had been cold for years. Becoming the person I needed. There was a time when I desperately wished for someone to show up. Someone to notice my exhaustion. Someone to ask if I was okay and mean it. Someone to sit with me in silence when I didn't have words. Someone to say, "You're not alone." But nobody came. And for a while, I believed that meant I wasn't worth saving. I was wrong. What it really meant was this. I was meant to become the person I needed. So I did. I learned to comfort myself, to hold myself through anxiety, to validate my own feelings, to encourage myself on the days I wanted to give up, to trust that my own love was enough. I became gentle with my fears, patient with my growth, compassionate with my mistakes, proud of my survival. And little by little, I realized I wasn't abandoned. I was awakening. I wasn't helpless. I was healing. I wasn't unworthy. I was rebuilding. I wasn't invisible. I was finally seeing myself clearly. And that was the moment everything changed. I no longer needed to be saved, because I finally understood something profound. The person who saves you is the one who refuses to leave you, and that person can be you. The day I realized nobody was coming to save me wasn't the day I lost hope. It was the day I discovered my strength. It was the day I picked myself up. The day I learned to breathe again. The day I chose myself, not as a last resort, but as a beginning. And it was the day I understood that saving myself was the most powerful thing I would ever do. The life that waited for me. There's a version of you that exists on the other side of survival, a version you can't see when you're drowning, a version you can't imagine when you're exhausted, a version you don't believe in when the world feels too heavy. But that version is real. And I didn't meet them until I stopped waiting for rescue. The first moment, I felt free. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, it was almost ordinary. I was walking outside, nothing special, just air and sky. And, suddenly, I wasn't afraid. Not afraid of being left. Not afraid of failing. Not afraid of being misunderstood. Not afraid of starting over. Not afraid of being alone. For the first time, fear wasn't the thing guiding me. It was there, yes, but it wasn't steering anymore. I realized freedom doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels like a calm breath you didn't know you were holding. I noticed my heart felt lighter. Not empty. Not numb. Not guarded. Just lighter. I wasn't carrying other people's expectations on my shoulders. I wasn't bending myself into shapes that hurt. I wasn't shrinking just to be accepted. I wasn't molding myself to be chosen. I was simply existing, as myself, without apology. And that was new, strange, beautiful. The world looked different because I was different. Colors felt sharper. Moments felt slower. Connections felt deeper. Life felt more intentional. Even the painful things felt meaningful. Because I wasn't experiencing them from a place of weakness anymore. I was experiencing them from a place of growth. Pain wasn't a punishment. It was a teacher. Loneliness wasn't emptiness. It was space. Silence wasn't rejection. It was clarity. I didn't know life could feel like this. Peaceful, soft, steady, mine. I no longer needed validation to feel real. For years, I needed others to tell me, "You're good. You're worth it. You're enough. You're loved." But when you learn to validate yourself, genuinely, not superficially, outside approval becomes a bonus, not a requirement. I started telling myself things I used to wait to hear. "I'm proud of you. You survived that. You're doing better than you think. You're allowed to rest. You deserve gentleness. You matter." And eventually, I believed it. The relationships that entered my life changed, too. Not because I forced anything. Not because I chased anything. But because authenticity attracts authenticity. Suddenly, people who valued depth found me. People who spoke truth without cruelty. People who gave love without conditions. People who didn't flinch when I was vulnerable. People who didn't require my silence to feel comfortable. Connections became quieter, but stronger. Fewer, but deeper. I didn't have a crowd. I had a circle, and that was enough. The old me would have thought this was impossible. The old me believed survival was the only thing life had to offer. The old me thought strength meant suffering quietly. The old me believed love required self-sacrifice. The old me waited for rescue, for recognition, for someone to finally choose me. But this version of me understands something different now. Nobody can save you the way you can save yourself. Nobody can love you the way you learn to love yourself. Nobody can give you peace if you deny it to your own heart. This isn't isolation. This is liberation. I didn't just find myself. I came home to myself. Asterisk, asterisk. To the version of me that feels deeply. To the version of me that speaks honestly. To the version of me that honors boundaries. To the version of me that refuses to shrink again. To the version of me that wants more, deserves more, expects more. I didn't know it then. But the day I realized nobody was coming to save me was the same day I started returning to who I was always meant to become. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel lost. I felt found. When strength started feeling natural, there comes a moment quiet, almost unnoticeable, when you realize strength no longer feels like a performance. For most of my life, being strong meant surviving what hurt. It meant pretending I was fine when I wasn't. It meant carrying burdens alone because I believed nobody else would understand. It meant swallowing pain so others could remain comfortable. But now, strength felt different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It wasn't exhausting. It was peaceful. The kind of strength that comes from knowing yourself. Not from fear, not from desperation, but from truth. I no longer asked for permission to be myself. I used to exist like I was borrowing space, apologizing even when I didn't speak, softening edges that were never sharp, playing small so no one felt threatened by my light. But healing taught me something powerful. You don't need permission to take up space in a world you were born in. So I stopped shrinking, stopped tiptoeing, stopped watering myself down to be digestible. I became fully present, in my voice, in my choices, in my emotions, in my identity, and the world didn't crumble. If anything, life expanded to meet the version of me I was finally allowing myself to be. The things that used to break me became lessons instead. Rejection used to crush me. Now, it simply redirects me. Losing people used to devastate me. Now I understand it creates space. Being misunderstood used to hurt deeply. Now I honor the truth that not everyone is meant to understand me. You see, pain didn't stop existing. It just stopped defining me. Because when you know who you are, you no longer chase people or places that require you to abandon yourself to feel accepted. You simply walk away, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I started trusting my own voice again. There was a time I doubted every feeling I had. I second-guessed every instinct. I waited for others to tell me what was right, what was wrong, what was worth holding on to. I handed my life to people who were never meant to carry it. But now, my voice is loud again, not the loudness of volume, but the loudness of certainty. I trust myself. I trust my judgment. I trust the path unfolding in front of me, even when it scares me, even when it's unfamiliar, even when I don't have all the answers. Especially then, I realized healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you to be smaller, before you were taught to silence your needs, before you learned that love meant sacrifice, before you believed your worth had to be earned, before you accepted crumbs and called it nourishment. Healing is a return, a reunion with the parts of yourself you abandoned to survive. And when you meet those parts again, they don't blame you. They don't resent you. They simply whisper, "I knew you'd come back." The day I stopped trying to prove myself, something powerful happened. The right people stayed. The wrong people left. Life became simpler. My heart became lighter. Because when you no longer live for the expectations of others, you begin living for the truth of yourself. I woke up one morning and realized I no longer felt the need to justify who I was, not to my past, not to anyone watching, not even to myself. The war inside me had quieted, not because I had won, but because I stopped fighting battles that weren't mine. I finally felt safe, with me, not the safety of perfect conditions, not the safety of having everything figured out, not the safety of knowing exactly where life was going, but the safety of knowing that no matter what happened, I wouldn't abandon myself again. That was the deepest peace I had ever known. The kind of peace that settles slowly, like sunlight warming a room that has been dark for far too long. A peace that whispers, "You're not who you were anymore. And you're not going back." And that's when I understood something life-changing. The day I realized nobody was coming to save me was not the day I was left alone. It was the day I stopped waiting, stopped hoping someone else would see me, stopped relying on rescue instead of responsibility, stopped giving away the power that was always mine. It was the day I chose myself, fully, unapologetically, deeply. And from that moment on, my life began. The moment I realized I had changed. Healing is strange. You don't notice it day by day. You don't wake up suddenly transformed. You don't feel yourself shifting while you're in survival mode. But one day, something happens. Something small, something ordinary, something you wouldn't have thought twice about in the past. And yet, you respond differently. That's when you know you've changed. It happened like this. Someone I cared about disappointed me. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just humanly. The old me would have panicked, overthought, blamed myself, tried harder, clung tighter, begged emotionally for reassurance, without ever saying the words. But this time, I breathed, I stepped back. I let it be what it was, not a reflection of my worth, not a sign that everything was falling apart, not a catastrophe, just a moment, a human moment. And instead of spiraling, I responded with calm understanding, for myself and for them. That was new, that was powerful, that was growth. I finally trusted that I would be okay. Not because everything in my life was perfect, because it wasn't. Not because people suddenly stopped hurting me, because they didn't. Not because life suddenly became easy, because it never does. I trusted I'd be okay, because I finally had the one thing that had been missing for years. A relationship with myself. A relationship where I listened. A relationship where I respected my own boundaries. A relationship where I didn't abandon myself just to earn connection. I became someone I could rely on. And when you have that, everything else becomes less frightening. When life started giving back, people often say that when you heal, your life begins to shift. I used to think that was a cliché, a nice thought, but unrealistic. But then I watched it happen. Not all at once, not with grand gestures, but with small gifts life offered me, one by one. As I made space for them, New opportunities appeared. Not because I was luckier, not because I suddenly became more talented, but because I stopped hiding. When you stop playing small, doors that were always there become visible. Things I once believed were out of reach now felt possible. Projects I was scared to start no longer intimidated me. Dreams I labeled as maybe one day became why not now. Life didn't change. I did. And life responded accordingly. Healthier people entered my life. Not perfect people, not flawless people, but people capable of connection. People who understood boundaries. People who valued honesty. People who didn't take kindness as an invitation to use me. People who stayed without being carried. People who listened without waiting to reply. The kind of people I thought didn't exist, because I was too busy making room for those who couldn't love me properly. Healing didn't push others away. It made room for the right ones. I started enjoying my own company. I used to fill every quiet moment with noise. Music, movies, distractions, conversations. Anything to avoid hearing my own thoughts. But now, silence wasn't punishment. It was peace. I didn't fear being alone anymore. I didn't rush to escape myself. I didn't feel empty without constant validation. I liked who I was becoming. I liked spending time with myself. I had finally grown into someone I enjoyed being around. Someone whose presence felt comforting, not overwhelming. And that changed everything. The final goodbye to who I used to be. There comes a point in every healing journey when you must say goodbye, not to people, but to yourself. To the version of you that didn't know better. The version that tolerated too much. The version that believed pain was normal. The version that thought silence was strength. The version that waited for saving instead of becoming the savior. This goodbye is gentle. It's emotional. It's necessary. Because you can't carry your past self into your future. They were built for survival, but you are building a life. I remembered who they were. The old me wasn't weak. They weren't foolish. They weren't pathetic. They were trying to find love, trying to stay afloat, trying to be enough, trying to understand why the world felt so heavy. The old me walked through pain I never deserved, carried burdens I never should have held, protected others while being wounded myself, gave without receiving, hoped without being met. That version of me deserves gratitude, not shame. They kept me alive long enough to become who I am now, so I released them. Not with anger, not with regret, but with love. I whispered internally, "Thank you for surviving, but you can rest now. I'll take it from here." And as I let go of who I used to be, I felt something inside me loosen. A tightness I carried for years, a rope I held onto because I didn't know I could release it. A heaviness I thought was part of my identity, but it wasn't. It was simply a weight from another chapter. And now, that chapter is closed. This was the true turning point. Not the moment I realized nobody was coming to save me, but the moment I accepted that I didn't need saving anymore. I needed understanding. I needed compassion. I needed connection. I needed growth. I needed purpose. But rescue? No. I had rescued myself, piece by piece, day by day, truth by truth. And in doing so, I finally stepped into a life that felt full. Not perfect. Not constant, not easy, but mine. The turning point I never expected. There is a moment in every journey, not loud, not dramatic, when everything inside you aligns without warning. A moment when your past, your pain, your growth, your healing, all converge into a single, quiet realization. I'm not who I was anymore. And the strangest part? You don't notice the change until life tests you again. It happened on a day that looked like any other. Nothing extraordinary, nothing symbolic, just a simple, ordinary moment. Someone spoke to me in a tone I would have once accepted, a tone that dismissed my feelings, a tone that minimized my experience, a tone I was once too afraid to challenge. And without thinking, without rehearsing, without fear, I said, "That's not okay with me." Calm, steady, clear, no shaking voice. No internal panic, no guilt creeping into my chest, just truth. And the room shifted, not because the world changed, but because I did. The old me would have folded, They would have apologized for feeling hurt, shrunk themselves to avoid conflict, blamed themselves for someone else's behavior, stayed silent to keep the peace, convinced themselves they were overreacting. But this version of me, the one who spent months rebuilding from the inside out, they didn't flinch, they didn't bend, they didn't disappear. They showed up for me, the way I used to wish someone else would. I felt a kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself. Not the strength that raises its voice. Not the strength that demands attention. Not the strength that comes from ego or fear. It was the strength of alignment. The quiet knowing of someone who finally understands their worth. The kind of strength that stands tall, even when nobody is watching. The kind of strength born from healing, not hardness. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't forcing confidence. I wasn't wearing a mask of bravery. I wasn't acting like someone who had healed. I was someone who had healed. I didn't feel the need to be chosen. For so long, I chased acceptance. I chased closeness. I chased love. I chased people who treated me like an option because I didn't know I deserved more. But now, I no longer felt the urge to prove myself worthy. I didn't need to be picked. I didn't need to be validated. I didn't need to be rescued. I didn't need to be understood by everyone. I only needed to be aligned with myself. And the freedom in that realization was overwhelming. I finally saw myself clearly. Not the version shaped by wounds. Not the version molded by fear. Not the version defined by who stayed or who left. I saw the one who survived. The one who kept going. The one who broke patterns that had been in place for years. The one who rebuilt themselves piece by piece. The one who stopped waiting for someone else to fix what they didn't break. I saw someone capable, someone resilient, someone worthy, someone enough. And for the first time, I wasn't surprised by who I saw. I was proud. I was no longer trying to return to my old self. Because healing didn't bring me back to who I used to be. It brought me forward, toward someone new, someone whole, someone intentional. The old version of me survived. This version of me lives. And in that distinction, I found a clarity that reshaped everything. The day I realized nobody was coming to save me was the day I learned I could save myself. Not just once, not just in emergency, but every day, in every choice, in every truth I speak. This was my turning point. The quiet shift that became the foundation of the life I'm building now. The day I finally became my own rescue. There is a silence that comes after healing. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of isolation, but the silence of arrival. A calm, steady quiet that says, "You made it." Not because the world changed, not because the past disappeared, not because people suddenly learned how to treat you. You made it because you did the work. Because you stopped waiting for someone else to show up. Because you stood in the wreckage of everything that hurt you and decided to build something better, something stronger, something softer, something yours. And here is the truth I learned at the end of it all. Nobody could save me, because nobody else lived in my heart. Nobody else knew the storms I was carrying. Nobody else felt the weight I moved through each day. Nobody else could hear the breaking inside me, the way I could. How could they save me? From a world they couldn't see? I wasn't abandoned. I was being redirected toward myself. And once I understood that, everything shifted. The loneliness became space. The silence became clarity. The heartbreak became a teacher. The waiting became a doorway. And on the other side of that doorway was a version of me I had never met, but had always needed. A version who didn't settle, who didn't shrink, who didn't apologize for existing, who didn't fear being alone, who didn't cling to what hurt. A version who knew that saving myself was not a burden. It was my rebirth, the final words. So here I am, not waiting anymore, not hoping someone will read my pain without me speaking it, not expecting rescue from a world that taught me to survive without it. I don't need someone to pull me from the darkness. I became the light, and the day I realized nobody was coming to save me wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of self-trust, the beginning of self-worth, the beginning of a life where I choose myself, without hesitation, without guilt, without permission. This is who I am now. Not the broken one, not the abandoned one, not the silent one, but the one who rose,